Centre Block, one of the country's most recognized buildings. It's the crown jewel of Ottawa's Parliament buildings and a fundamental symbol of Canada. Designed in the Gothic Revival style by John Pearson, it's an architectural masterpiece. A combination of immense size and scope with painstaking artistry and craftsmanship. It's reminiscent of Westminster, and yet it's uniquely Canadian. Home to both Houses of Parliament, this building is often referred to as an icon of democracy. Now this historic building is closed, undergoing the largest and most complex heritage rehabilitation project ever undertaken in Canada. On November 6, 1867, Canada's first Parliament met here in the House of Commons. This is what Centre Block looked like in those early days of Confederation. Back then, Ottawa was perhaps not the most sophisticated of places. Many had been surprised a decade earlier when Queen Victoria named it the capital. Canada's first Governor-General, Lord Monck, remarked that the place could never amount to much. Lady Monk's criticism was harsher, writing in her diary that they were much disgusted by the squalid look of Ottawa. I went on wondering how we could ever live there. Despite this apparent lack of enthusiasm for the new capital, planning and construction of the Parliament buildings began. Johanna Mizgala is the House of Commons curator. She knows more about the history of this building than just about anyone.
To understand the building on Parliament Hill and its context for the renovation and restoration plan, we really have to go back in time and consider the original building, which sat on Parliament Hill and was designed by Thomas Fuller and Chilean Jones. So that building was a neo-Gothic building, and the building that we know today shares some similarities in terms of its exterior, but it's a very different and truly 20th century building.
Centre Block officially opened in June 1866, but the Parliament buildings were not yet complete. And a year later, on July 1st, 1867, the Dominion of Canada was born. Along with it came an enhanced sense of pride towards Ottawa, its reputation as a muddy shantytown fading fast. The young capital was growing and transforming. Ornate, decorative, and innovative, many regarded this group of buildings as some of the finest examples of Gothic Revival architecture in the world.
So that building was on the site for about 50 years. And then on the 3rd of February 1916, there was a fire that broke out and essentially destroyed the building. Two architects were commissioned to do a study to see if they could actually rebuild on the site. So Toronto architect John Pearson and an architect from Montreal, Joseph Omer Marchand, were brought together. They had never met before this project, and the task at hand for them was to create this sort of proposal as to what could be done. Now, they really seized the opportunity to take into consideration that Canada had changed considerably from 1867 to 1916, and that really what was needed here was a building for the 20th century, and a building that would last for the next generations and the Canada that was to come.
With only the library still standing, Pearson and Marchand proposed a brand new structure. Their design was a neo-Gothic exterior with a distinctly modern interior.
They took into account the original structure from the exterior, so it looked very much like what had been there originally, but very much a Beaux-Arts 20th century building inside. So they wanted the architecture to speak to the people who would have to use this building, to tell them about the places that they come from, the people that they represent, and essentially the duty that they had to Canadians. They were chosen, they are elected to represent a much wider constituency than themselves, and they are brought together to make decisions about legislation which ultimately trickles back to those people.
By the fall of 1916, the reconstruction of Centre Block was well underway. But the country was still in the grip of the deadly First World War, and Parliament urgently needed a place to sit. The House of Commons and Senate would meet here in the newly completed Victoria Memorial Museum, now the Canadian Museum of Nature. Fossils, minerals, and exhibitions were pushed to the back of the room. For nearly 4 years, this was the home of Canada's Parliament while construction of Centre Block continued.
So construction occurred between 1916 and 1920. They moved back into the space in 1920. Construction continued over the next almost 10 years with the Peace Tower. And then over the years since then, the decorative program of the building has continued right up until the closure of the building in 2018, when we moved out so that we could restore and rehabilitate the building for the 21st century.
Architect John Pearson oversaw every detail of the building's design.
Pearson designed what we would call a total work of art, in the sense that not only the physical structure of the building, but the decorative elements, the furnishings, even the organization of space, was all about making sure that people understood what the building's purpose was, why it exists, and what happens in that building. So it is, of course, the space where the legislation of the country is determined, and MPs and senators have this very important role to play, and they need an appropriate space for that work to occur. The Beaux-Arts style is really a 20th century plan, and it's characterized by a hierarchy of space, a simplicity of sense of purpose for the building. So there's a hierarchy in terms of decorative elements, which means that the spaces that are the most important to the understanding of the place warrant the highest decoration and highest design principles. So when you go into Centre Block, you are immediately to understand where you are. You're immediately to understand that everything to your right is related to the Senate, everything to your left is related to the House of Commons, and that there is an order and a structure to the space. So the highest decorated spaces are, for instance, the two speakers' offices, because in a sense it is their house. Then you would think of the chambers, because that's where the most important work happens, and then the Prime Minister's office and the Leader of the Opposition. And then there's an organization to the rooms that are for public functions. But as you go up to higher and higher floors and you get to office spaces, it really looks a lot like any sort of typical 20th century building of the time. There's a pragmatism to the way that decor is used. There's a choice of finishes. The sort of what we call the noblest materials are used in the most important places. So the kinds of wood, the kinds of marble, everything is conceived to give you a sense of this place and understanding. So as much as possible, Canadian, or at the very least North American, materials were used in the space to remind people of the places in which they come from to gather in Ottawa in these two chambers.
Pearson also included several themes that run through the entire building. One of the most integral is the ship of state metaphor. Here in Center Block's main entrance, the figure of Poseidon is carved into the central column of Confederation Hall. Poseidon is the ancient Greek god of the seas, storms, and earthquakes.
And then there is what's called a rose compass. And using the marble on the floor, there's a view of the sea, the land, and then ultimately the cosmos. And the idea, again, is this metaphor of the ship of state. The idea that no matter how rocky times might be, there is essentially order in good governance, and there is always somebody steering the ship and central to the helm. And when you're in the Prime Minister's office, there are nautical decorative elements throughout because, of course, the Prime Minister is steering the ship. And throughout the building, there are little touches related to either fish or sea creatures or things that remind you of this metaphor. So the idea is that when you walk through the building, there are things that you'll see at the beginning, but you'll see them as you go through. And it's a way that you can be constantly reminded of these narratives about who we are, what we're doing in this place, what this place means to the kind of underpinnings and structure of our country and our democracy.